So welcome to podcast number 3. There are actually 2 previous podcasts that are available if you haven't seen them. And one of the purposes for these podcasts that we are kind of beginning to do is that if there's some topics or themes that don't quite fit in the sermon series that are related but don't really kind of have their own separate sermon, that we might address some of those, or maybe in some cases, questions that you might have, we might have a discussion about them in the podcast. But what I want to do now is just something I've been thinking about based on some texts in Exodus that none of them are really going to kind of fit together in their own little sermon. But it's a way for us to reflect a little bit, especially I'm thinking about the sermon that we had last Sunday about how we reflect God from Exodus chapter 19. And especially I want us to think through a little bit about how we can reflect God's view of people and what that might look like in our own contemporary day and time. And there's some very interesting verses in the book of Exodus that kind of address that, or just give little signs or hints about the way that God views people. So I want to talk through those and talk some about application, and I want to end up with what is potentially maybe a controversial kind of idea or point, but I just want to throw it out to you for your reflection. So how do we reflect God's values, especially God's values when it comes to people? And the first place I want to look at is in Exodus chapter 30. And again, this probably won't come up in its own sermon. It's not like one of the major passages in the book of Exodus. But Exodus chapter 30, starting in verse 11. Exodus is describing the tabernacle and the parts in it, and then part of that story is people contributing to the building of the tabernacle. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them," okay, when you're counting the people, how many are there? "Each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life the time he is counted." Okay, so it's a kind of tax that goes with the census, but it's for their life, and each one must pay it. "Then no plague will come on them when you number them. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give a half shekel, according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs." I have no idea exactly how much that is worth. That's not the point right now. This is the point. "This half shekel is an offering to the Lord. All who cross over, those 20 years old or more, are to give an offering to the Lord. The rich are not to give more than a half shekel. The poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives. Receive this atonement money, this payment for each person from the Israelites, and use it for service in the tent of meeting." I think it's actually very significant, the point here about the rich gives that same amount, the poor give that same amount, and that's communicating that when it comes to their worth before God, they are equal. Whoever they are, whatever their economic status, in terms of their status with God, they're equal, and each one is required to pay the same amount. Now, there's other kind of offerings that the people might give, and you can find different examples of that in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. When Jesus was born, his parents were poor, and they more or less gave a poor person's sacrifice. Okay, and so some people could give big sacrifices, some people small sacrifices, depending on the kind of sacrifice. But here, when it comes to their place in the community and their status with God, I think this is communicating they are equal. They have equal status, and God sees them as being equal. Okay, and that's a sign of the worth or the value that God puts on people. Another example of this is in Exodus chapter 20, And in fact, we're going to be looking at the laws, the Ten Commandments, and we'll talk a little bit about the Sabbath law. But in Exodus chapter 20, one of the Ten Commandments is about keeping the Sabbath and how they are to keep the Sabbath. And so the law states this: remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. It's special. It's not ordinary. 6 days you will work. On the seventh day, though, that's a Sabbath. It's a rest to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. And this is a critical point. Neither you nor your son or daughter or your manservant or your maidservant, nor your animals, or the alien or foreigner within your gates. For 6 days the Lord made heavens and the earth and the sea, all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. My point for right now is that the Sabbath was for everyone. Male, female, free or slave, and even for the animals. Everyone was offered this rest. And again, this is an indication of the way God sees people. People who have all sorts of different statuses in world's terms. Rich, poor, free, slave, male, female, and all those ways in which, people might identify themselves, or the ways in which they are labeled. Here God says the Sabbath rest is for everyone equally. And so part of what's being communicated here, and this is a theme that runs through the Bible, I believe, is this equal worth. I mean, it really goes back to being created in God's image. All humans are in God's image, and therefore all people have equal worth in God's sight. Okay? So we are obligated to reflect that. If God views everyone equally, they have equal value in God's sight, then in our individual lives, we need to reflect that. As we go about our day and we interact with people, we shouldn't be biased toward rich people or these people or those people. We shouldn't label people in the way that the world labels people. Our labels, our thoughts toward people and our interaction with people needs to reflect how God sees them. Okay, so that's how we apply this kind of in our individual life. Of course, when it comes to more corporate entities, this becomes difficult. And so what I want to talk about a little bit is how some of these verses in the Old Testament are being used in political and national discussion. And so here's a particular problem, and it has to do with the reality in many nations, certainly in America, but also in many European nations, is a matter of fact, we have people crossing the border. Some just come as students, many of you, students or temporary workers, but it also includes immigrants and refugees, and people who are entering the country who are not native to there. And it's a huge discussion in political terms. What about these people and how do we treat them? And in that discussion, people who are, followers of Jesus and see the Bible as a kind of authority, of course, we want to go to the Bible and see what the Bible tells us about that. And so here's one of the verses that get brought up in that discussion about how do we treat the foreigner, the alien living among us. And so, for instance, in Exodus chapter 22, of course, the people of Israel, they also had foreigners, aliens, strangers living among them. And so in Exodus chapter 22, starting in verse 21, God says, it's part of the law, do not mistreat an alien or oppress him, for you were aliens in Egypt. Don't take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry, and my anger will be aroused. God will be angry if his people treat the foreigner and alien, the widow and the orphan badly. In fact, this is what, I'm just reading what the text says. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. And this is one of a number of places where the people are reminded to, you were aliens and strangers in Egypt. And that reality needs to affect the way that you see the foreigner, stranger, and alien among you. It comes up again in Deuteronomy chapter 10, just the same kind of idea. And if you remember our Isaiah series, we talked about this a number of times, the justice that is owed to the widow and the orphan and the stranger. But in Exodus chapter 10, or Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 17, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome. He shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the alien, giving him food and clothing. And you are to love those who are aliens, for you yourselves were aliens in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him. Take your oaths in his name. He is your praise. He is your God. Okay, so some people read those verses in the Old Testament and they say, well, that proves that, the refugees, immigrants, whoever comes, across the border, that we are to welcome them. Okay? So that's one way, and people have tried to take Scripture. How does it apply there? On the other hand, what some people say is, well, that's not completely analogous, what's in the Old Testament to our situation. So some people would say, well, but those foreigners are people who are going to live within the covenant. They're going to worship Yahweh as God. They're going to be circumcised. They're going to keep the law, and so they will become like Jews and live like Jews, even though they're not ethnic Jews. And so some people might say, well, therefore, those verses don't necessarily apply, to our current political and national situation. Okay. On the other hand, actually, if you look at Exodus chapter 12, you find in Israel there was a wide variety of foreigners. There were foreigners who, yes, they lived like the Jewish people, they accepted the covenant, but as a matter of fact, there are all sorts of other kinds of foreigners who lived in the land. Economic refugees, people who just wanted to work a while or whatever, and so here's my point. We ought to, as we think about these kind of questions, not just about our individual lives, but our lives as citizens, our political lives, we need to look to the Bible and to see what kind of wisdom the Bible might give. But the reality is this, when the Bible was written, that was several thousand years ago in a very different context. And one of the things I've said a number of times is that we have to be very careful about just taking some, let's say, Old Testament law and bringing it into today as if it's, it has the same meaning, the same idea, and it's a law for us today like it was for them. And we can't do that because, that's a different context. And so, yes, we need to look at these different verses that I've read, but we also need to understand, okay, our context is a little bit different. The current foreigners and strangers and aliens living in the land, maybe they're not exactly like the foreigners, aliens, and strangers living in the land of Israel 3,000 years ago. So where are we? Are we left with nothing? No, we're not. We're left with God's values on people. And our lives, if we're followers of Jesus, our obligation is to reflect what God thinks about people. Nations can do what nations need to do. I'm not making a political comment here. America or Latvia or whatever other country, they can make their decisions based on whatever values they have, but God's people are obligated to reflect how God views people. Okay? We reflect God. And how we label people, how we see people, needs to reflect God. How I view people should not reflect my gender. It should reflect God's value on people. And how I view people should not be a reflection of my economic status. It should be a reflection of God. And how I view people and label people. And oh, it's so easy to label people. They're in this category, they're this, and we use the world's label for people. But how we think of people and label people should not reflect our ethnic status. It needs to reflect God. And how we talk about people and view people and treat people ought not to reflect our passport or our flag. It needs to reflect God. We reflect God. We need to understand how God views people all through the Bible. And whatever anyone else does, God's people are obligated to reflect God's view of people. So that's my little prophetic word in this podcast, something for you to reflect on this week.